Organizing Scientific Writing is an instructional presentation brought to you by Dr. Joshua Paiz in cooperation with the NYU Shanghai Writing Program. This presentation will discuss the rhetorical moves of a typical experiment-based scientific paper. Lab reports are a good example of the kinds of paper I'm going to talk about. When many of you think of rhetoric, you may think of argument, and in a certain sense, there is an argument being made in your scientific writing. Namely, the argument is that your methods are sound and your findings valid. Also, you're working to build ethos or credibility with your reader, saying, I'm a member of this discourse community, and you should listen to what I have to say. The basic global rhetorical patterning of a scientific report is best known by its acronym, IMRaD. IMRaD stands for Introduction, Materials and Methods, Results, and Discussion, the major sections of the paper. Now in each of these sections, there are some minimal moves that need to be made. Let's zoom into each level and take a look. Take a moment to read over this introduction. While you're reading, take note of what's being done. What is the author attempting to convey to the reader? What rhetorical moves are happening here? A good introduction should make the following rhetorical moves. It should provide a global introduction to the rest of the paper and to the issue being investigated. This means that you should introduce the experiment and possibly provide context for why the experiment is being carried out, or how it connects to previous research or other experiments. You should then clearly state your objective and working hypothesis that guided the experiment. This is important in crafting what is known as a scientific narrative. You can often wrap up an introduction section with an advanced organizer, a short paragraph that previews the rest of the paper. The next section of the standard empirical paper, like a report of research or lab report, is the methods and materials section. In this section, you will want to inform the reader of what you used to carry out your research and the specific steps that you went through to carry out your experiment and to collect your data. This means that there are three major rhetorical moves that you should keep in mind as you're writing this section. First, report your work in the past tense. This is to reflect, in the scientific narrative, that this is not ongoing work, but work that has been fully completed by the time you wrote and turned in the report. Second, report the steps of the experiment in chronological order. And third, use sufficient detail. 2 and 3 are important because they allow others to replicate your work. In doing so, you should assume that your reader has some technical experience and understanding. That is, you're not writing for the complete novice. This means that you don't have to write this section like an instruction set. Rather, you should provide just enough detail that someone could reasonably recreate what you did and hopefully get similar results. The bottom half of this slide contains an example of a passage from a well-written methods section. Take a moment to read it over. Another important move to make in the methods and materials section is to lay bare any underlying assumptions that you have that may influence your experiment, or may unduly influence your interpretation of your findings or how you explore the possible implications of those findings as they relate to your hypothesis. Underlying assumptions are simply those things that you assume to be true and that inform how you view the world in your experiment. The following slide will show you an example of a passage that tries to lay bare some underlying assumptions. Take a moment to read it over and think about how the author communicates their underlying assumptions to the reader. This passage, which comes from a published research report on rodent food hoarding, lays bare for the reader what the research assumed to be true about hoarding behaviors and the animal's intentionality. This transparency regarding assumptions is reflected in the act of clearly defining their terms in a way that is relevant to the phenomenon under study. Notice also the repeated use of the verb considered, which highlights the researcher's agency in interpreting animal behavior. Finally, in the Methods and Materials section, you should be certain to highlight any specialized equipment or analytics that were used in carrying out your experiment or in analyzing your data. Where necessary, explain why you chose this tool or method over another potentially more common one. The next section is the results section, in which you present your findings to the readers. There are a couple of things to keep in mind about the kinds of rhetorical moves being made in this section. First and foremost, provide a concise summary of your primary findings. Then, be sure to give the facts and nothing but the facts. Be sure to present your findings in a clear, logical manner. Avoid wordiness or inaccessible writing. If you're working with very complex data, you may want to begin with an explanatory paragraph and a brief summary. Take a moment to read over this example of a results section paragraph. Reflect on how it does or doesn't do the kinds of rhetorical moves that were just discussed. In this example, you'll notice that they begin by summarizing their finding, that aquatic habitat size varied throughout the year. They then provide the facts that support this finding, pointing to the role of stream discharge and changes in surface area. Notice that they don't interpret these findings. That is, they don't tell us what they mean relative to their hypothesis. They give us the facts and nothing but the facts. The final section of an empirical research report is the discussion section, in which you make sense of the findings that you presented in the results section. In the discussion, you should also relate your findings to the study's objectives and draw connections back to the results and the introduction section. And if your introduction section introduced previous scientific literature, your discussion should draw connections back to that literature. This helps to create a scientific narrative that is present in all well-written research reports. Also, be sure that any of your implications are logically derived from your chosen theoretical framework and results. Don't speculate wildly. Finally, don't forget to include your references section after your discussion section ends. This has been a presentation of Organizing Scientific Writing, brought to you by Dr. Joshua Paiz in cooperation with the NYU Shanghai Writing Program.